In June 1866, 4 men walked into the hills outside Nelson. They weren't miners, they weren't travellers, and they were definitely not lost. They were waiting. Somewhere behind them on the same rough mountain track were men carrying gold, cash, and everything they had ever worked for. By the next evening, 5 men would be dead. A pack horse would be shot and dragged away like evidence, and the men responsible would walk into Nelson, take rooms under false names, sell stolen gold, and try to disappear into the ordinary life of the town. 3 of them would hang. 1 talked his way out of the noose. And at the centre of it all was Richard Burgess, a transported convict, a Goldfields predator, and one of the most infamous killers in New Zealand's history. This isn't a mystery about who did it. This is a story of how a gang formed, how they hunted, and how one lonely track near Nelson became one of the darkest crime scenes colonial New Zealand has ever seen. This is a story of the Burgess Gang, and this is Southern Static. Before Richard Burgess was Richard Burgess, he was Richard Hill. Even his name was part of the act. Burgess was born in London in 1829, and from a young age he was already moving through the criminal world. He wasn't some desperate man who made one bad choice. Crime was his pattern, not the exception. At 16 years old, he was transported from London to Melbourne for theft. Taken from England, shipped halfway across the world, and dropped into the brutal convict system of another country. For some men, transportation was supposed to be a warning, a chance to start again. Richard Hill didn't come out reformed. He came out a whole lot harder. After his release, he went back to crime. Robbery, prison, escape attempts, violence, new names, new towns, new opportunities. And somewhere along the way, Richard Hill became Richard Burgess. The name itself apparently came from a man he'd once tried to rob in New South Wales. It almost feels too perfect, because Burgess didn't just steal money, he stole identities. He had the feeling of a man always measuring the room, where the exits were, where the weak points sat, who could be lied to and who could be stood over, and how quickly he could vanish when the ground beneath him started shaking. By the early 1860s, gold had changed the South Island of New Zealand. Otago was booming, the West Coast was booming. Men were flooding into rough settlements with gold in their pockets and hope in their hearts. This wasn't a world of bank transfers, police radios and easy comms. This was men walking through bush, down long mountain tracks, big distances with real gold dust, real cash, and sometimes everything they owned tied to themselves or their pack horse. A man could leave one settlement and be expected in another. If he never arrived, the first explanation might be whether a wrong turn a swollen river, a delay at another camp, or possibly a change of plans. That was the weakness men like Burgess liked to exploit. To honest men, the Goldfields were opportunity. To Richard Burgess, they were hunting grounds. In January of 1862, Burgess left Australia for the Otago Goldfields. He wasn't alone for long. Soon as he got here, he connected with another man from his past, Thomas Noon, a name that would later become Thomas Kelly, who'd come through the same world of convictions, prisons, and aliases. Kelly matters because he wasn't just another man Burgess met on the road. He was the old criminal partner, the old familiar face, the man who had already been beside Burgess when things had turned violent. The 2 men began doing what they knew. They targeted lone prospectors, found men carrying value, isolated them, overwhelmed them, took what they had, and then disappeared. In March of 1862, police tried to bring Burgess and Noon in for questioning over a robbery at Weatherston's. Gunfire broke out. They fled, but were eventually captured. They claimed Noon's gun had gone off accidentally. The court didn't buy it. Both men were sentenced to 3.5 years hard labour in Dunedin jail. For Burgess, that sentence became personal. During one of his escape attempts, he received 36 lashes. And according to the story that followed him afterwards, he vowed revenge. A life taken for every lash he received. We need to be careful with lines like this. Men like Burgess loved drama, they loved myth. Whether he said it exactly or whether it hardened into legend later, the point stands either way. Burgess didn't leave prison humbled. He left it angry. In September of 1865, Burgess and Noon were released, and the Otago police walked them to the province border at the Waitaki River personally. When police don't just release you, but physically march you out of their patch, they're not wishing you luck. They're making you someone else's problem. So Burgess and Noon headed for the west coast. By early October, they were in Hokitika, and for once, they tried to look respectable. They told the police they were going straight, that they'd work honestly as miners. They staked a claim and land from Hokitika. Thomas Noon became Thomas Kelly, and Burgess started living with a woman named Carrie, who was carrying his child. For a moment, from the outside, you could almost believe it. A claim, a woman and a baby on the way. A version of Richard Burgess who'd gone straight. It didn't hold. By Christmas, the robberies had started again. And whatever Carrie thought she was building with him, the record didn't say. She simply disappears from it, the way people do when they're standing too close to a man like Burgess. She's one more person history didn't think was worth following. Now this is where the gang begins to take shape. The next figure is Philip Levy. Levy wasn't street muscle like Burgess. He was dangerous in a quieter way. He'd worked as a gold buyer, so he understood how money moved through the goldfields, who might be carrying something worth taking, and how to fence stolen goods once they had them. He'd read the terrain before anyone else set foot on it. He knew where value moved. He knew who might be worth following. That was his role, that was his worth. That made Levy dangerous in a way a knife or a revolver never could. He could make murder possible before anyone had drawn the first weapon. Then, in April of 1866, Joseph Sullivan arrived from Victoria, also transported from England as a young man, later a prize fighter and a publican. Tough, experienced, old enough to know exactly what he was walking into. Right now, he's just the last man in. The other three have no idea what he will become. With Sullivan in place, the gang was complete. Richard Burgess, Thomas Kelly, Philip Levy, Joseph Sullivan. 4 men who'd all come up through the Australian goldfields. 3 of them transported from England for earlier crimes. They weren't young idiots playing at bushrangers. They were experienced crims in a country where gold moved faster than the police could follow. And Kelly, the old partner, was still right where he had been in Otago, close to Burgess, following the same momentum, even as every step got darker and darker. In May of 1866, they began their final spree. The first stretch of it almost looks chaotic on paper, but slow it down and you can see the same pattern Burgess has been running his whole life. Rob, get close to getting caught, talk or bluff his way out, then vanish before the cops can close their hand. On the 10th of May, Burgess stole 2 revolvers from the Hokitika police camp. Then, and this is pure Burgess, he staged discovering those same weapons on a nearby beach in front of witnesses, so that later on, when police had found the guns in his room, he had an alibi ready-made. It's a small moment, but it tells you exactly who we're dealing with. This is a man who thought 2 steps ahead of the law as a reflex, not as an exception. Now, the police weren't stupid. They couldn't make the charges stick, so they leaned on the press instead, feeding the Hokitika papers details of Burgess's record in Dunedin, then quietly advising him and Kelly to leave town. The old pattern repeated. Burgess escaped the consequences, but not the attention. On the 24th of May, Burgess, Kelly and Sullivan headed overland for Greymouth. Levy went separately on a steamer boat. Their target was a gold buyer named Edward Fox. This is the gang's method laid bare. Levy finds the mark, the others do the violence. Then everyone regroups and carries the proceeds somewhere else. It's a business model. That's what makes it so cold. There's no romance in it, there's no honour, there's no glamour. Just straight calculation, threat and profit. But almost immediately it started coming apart. A police inspector transferred from Hokitika to Greymouth and the pressure spiked. Burgess, Kelly and Sullivan tried to shake surveillance by crossing the Grey River to Cobden, outside the provincial boundary. Then, after drinking, they crossed back, and on the 28th of May, they murdered George Dobson. Sit with that name for a second, because he tends to get lost in this story. Dobson was a land surveyor, not a criminal. Not a target, not even the man they were meant to kill. He was doing ordinary, necessary work in a young colony that badly needed men like him. Mapping the ground, laying routes, the unglamorous labour that made the goldfields workable at all. He had a life outside this story that this story never gets to tell. And the gang killed him because they mistook him for someone else. Wrong man, wrong place, wrong time. That's the whole reason George Dobson is dead. Now this is the line the gang never came back from. Before Dobson, they were robbers, violent career criminals. Dangerous? Yes. After Dobson, murder wasn't theoretical anymore. Dobson proved the gang could kill by mistake. Mangatapu would prove something else, that they could kill on purpose and plan it well in advance. 3 days later, on the 31st of May, they set an ambush for the real Edward Fox, but the police were ahead of them. Fox travelled with an armed escort disguised as miners. The gang spotted them beforehand and stayed hidden. Another plan failed. Police still couldn't prove anything. They didn't yet know Dobson was dead. So Inspector James simply gave the gang 48 hours to leave town. You can feel the story tightening here. Everywhere this gang goes, police are close behind them. Every plan is half detected. Every robbery nearly collapses. Yet still, they are free. On the 2nd of June, Burgess, Sullivan and Kelly rejoined Levi aboard the steamer Wallaby, travelling under assumed names headed for Westport to rob a bank. When they arrived, the bank was closed, so that plan shifted again. Another plan foiled. Next stop, Nelson. By the 6th of June, the gang reached Nelson nearly penniless. Now that changes the temperature of everything. This isn't just violent men chasing opportunity anymore. These are desperate men who have failed repeatedly in every town they've been so far. Hokitika got too hot, Greymouth nearly caught them. Dobson was dead for nothing, Fox got away, Westport was a dead end. In Nelson they considered robbing the bank, but there was too much police presence. So they changed the plan again. They'd walk 70 miles to Picton and find an opportunity there. To get there, they'd take the Maungatapu Track. And that decision would make their names infamous. The Maungatapu Track was rugged, isolated and dangerous, linking the settlements and diggings in a way that made sense for travellers, miners and businessmen. But what made it useful also made it deadly. There were stretches where a traveller was completely exposed, sections where help was simply too far away to matter. For Burgess, it looked perfect. On the 10th of June, the gang reached Canvastown, a Goldfields settlement around 40 miles short of Picton, and talked a local storekeeper named George Jervis into letting them stay in an empty hut. While they were there, Levi did what Levi did. He found a target. At nearby Deep Creek, he ran into Felix Matthew, a publican and storekeeper he'd known back in Otago, a man in his 40s who'd worked the goldfields. He knew Levi by name and he trusted him. That trust is what put him on Levi's list. Matthew was prepping to travel with 3 other men, James Dudley, John Kempthorne and James de Pontius. They were all carrying money and gold. They were not walking into legend. They were walking to Nelson expecting the ordinary things at the end of an ordinary hard road. Business, rooms, meals, letters, conversations, maybe a drink at the end of it. The sort of things men imagine when the track is rough but the destination is close enough to feel real. To Levi, they weren't 4 lives. They were the opportunity the gang had been chasing. No bank vault, no armed escort, no town full of police, just 4 men on an isolated track. The plan formed quickly. Ambush Matthew's party near the summit of the Maungatapu Track. And this is what makes the case so cold. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. It wasn't a drunken argument or one man pulling a weapon in panic. They planned in advance to stop travellers in the hills, rob them, and leave no witnesses. On the morning of the 12th of June, the gang left Canvastown early and took position up on the track. But before Matthew's party came through, another man appeared. James Battle. He was in his 50s and a flax grower. Not a target, just a man who passed through the wrong place at the wrong time. At first they let him go, and for one brief moment, James Battle lived. Then Burgess and Sullivan started to worry. Battle had seen them. He could identify them. If the ambush went ahead and word got out, Battle could place them on that track. So they went after him, attacked him, robbed him of the few pounds he had, and buried him in a shallow grave. It's easy to let a name like Battle's pass by in a list of victims. So slow down on him for a second. He didn't try to rob the gang, he didn't threaten them. He didn't even know what he'd stumbled into. His only crime was walking a public track on the wrong afternoon and having a working pair of eyes. He was a man with a flax patch and presumably a life waiting for him somewhere down that track, killed for the simple, arbitrary reason that he could describe 4 faces to a magistrate. That's not a killing born of rage, that's a killing born of arithmetic. The gang camped overnight at Franklin's flat, waiting for their intended victims. Somewhere in that lonely country, James Battle was already in the ground, and the 4 men they'd actually come for were still walking toward them, with no idea the track ahead of them had already taken a life. On the 13th of June, around 1 in the afternoon, Felix Matthieu, James Dudley, John Kempthorne, and James de Pontius reached the track, travelling with a pack horse called Old Farmer. They believed they were on a hard, ordinary journey through difficult country. They didn't know what they were walking into. They didn't know the execution had already been planned. The gang stopped them, robbed them, and then one by one killed them. James Dudley was strangled. John Kempthorpe was shot. James de Pontius was shot. Felix Matthieu, the man who trusted Levi, was shot and stabbed. This wasn't quick chaos. It was controlled enough that the gang could think clearly about staging the scene afterwards. They took cash and gold dust worth around £326. In 1866, that was roughly 2 years' wages for a working man. Enough to matter, but nowhere near enough to buy the freedom or the fresh start any of them was chasing. But it was enough to kill for in their minds. 6 men would die for a year's worth of wages. They led Old Farmer away and shot him too. Old Farmer wasn't just in the way, he was the last living link back to 4 missing men. A horse that could be traced, questioned about, followed home. Killing him wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the gang erasing any evidence that happened to breathe. They hid the bodies, and then they did something almost worse than the killing. They buried de Pontius separately from the others, arranged deliberately to suggest that he had murdered his 3 companions and then fled the scene. Think about the mind required for that. These men had just taken 5 lives in 2 days, battled the day before, 4 more that afternoon, and in the middle of it, they still had the composure to conduct a lie out of a corpse. To hand a dead man a crime he didn't commit, so a living search party might chase a ghost instead of them. Now that's not panic, that's not even greed. That's men who'd learned to think like the hunted while still acting like the hunters. Calculating right down to the last shovel of dirt. Then they walked on to Nelson. That same evening, they arrived in town and booked into different hotels under false names. Levi, ever the careful one, took a separate room from the others. The same instinct for distance that had made him useful to the gang would soon make him the first one police would isolate. Picture Nelson that night. Ordinary streets, lamplight, publicans pulling last drinks, families asleep. A small colonial town had no idea 4 men had just crossed its threshold with someone else's blood still drying under their fingernails. Behind them, they'd left 5 bodies and a dead horse. The killers paid for their beds, sat down to eat, and slept under roofs like anyone else. Now that's the unbearable gap in this story. Not only the violence on the track, but the ordinariness that came straight after. The next day, they sold the stolen gold and split the proceeds. Then they decided to lay low for a week before taking a ship to New Plymouth. But they'd made one mistake. Felix Matthieu and his party were expected. A man named Henry Moeller was waiting in Nelson to retrieve Old Farmer and take the horse back to Canvastown. The men didn't arrive, the horse didn't arrive. Moeller knew something was wrong. On the 15th of June, he reported the disappearances to police, then rode back to Canvastown. There, George Jervis remembered the men he'd let stay in the empty hut. Levi, in particular, had been noticed. The gang had tried to move through quietly, stealthily, but they'd left impressions everywhere. Seen, remembered, and tracked. Their movements had formed a trail without them even realising it. Police started putting it all together. Searchers found signs of a crime. Levi was arrested first. Then on the 19th of June, Burgess, Kelly, and Sullivan were found and arrested under the names they'd been using: Miller, Noon, and McGee. But there was still a problem. Suspicion isn't proof. Without bodies, the case was circumstantial. Police had a gang, witnesses, suspicious spending, and movements that matched the route, but not the dead. Then, the government made the men an offer. £200 and a free pardon to any accomplice, not the actual murderer, who gave evidence leading to conviction. The notice was posted where they could see it, and that's when the gang began to rot from the inside. Police suspected Philip Levi might take the deal first, so they separated him from the others. Joseph Sullivan saw what was happening and moved before anyone else could. He told police he'd only been a lookout. He blamed the others. He gave them exactly the story they needed. Most importantly, he led the searchers straight to the bodies. The last man into the gang became the first man out. On the 28th of June, the bodies of Manatū, Dudley, Kempthorne and De Pontius were recovered because of Sullivan's evidence. James Battle's body was found 3 days later. Sullivan also told police about George Dobson's murder on the West Coast. In one move, Joseph Sullivan became the most important witness in the case and saved himself from the fate of the men beside him. But Richard Burgess wasn't the kind of man to go quietly. If Sullivan was going to tell a story, Burgess was too. And he had one weapon left: his own confession. In jail, he began writing his life, his crimes, the murders, dramatic, self-aware, clearly built to control how the world would remember him. At the trial, Burgess represented himself. So did Kelly. The case opened in Nelson in September of 1866 before Justice Johnson, and by then the public was obsessed. This wasn't just another criminal trial. It was colonial New Zealand staring straight at the Goldfields dream and finally seeing what had been standing in the shadows next to it the whole time. Burgess wanted to destroy Sullivan. He cross-examined him for hours, trying to paint him as the real killer hiding behind a deal with the Crown. Picture that courtroom. A self-represented murderer, still performing, still negotiating his own legacy from the dock, trying to convince a packed public gallery that he was guilty. Yeah, but at least he was honest about it. Damned but truthful. A killer, but not a coward. And in his version, Sullivan was the coward. The snake who killed, lied, and then hid behind the Crown to save his own neck. The court didn't buy it. Justice Johnson leaned toward and told Burgess exactly what he thought he was: an arch plotter, a cruel assassin, one of the wickedest men to stand in that dock. He said it to Burgess's face in front of the gallery. The jury took less than an hour. Burgess, Kelly, and Levi were found guilty of murder. Kelly collapsed and was carried away sobbing. Levi kept protesting his innocence. Burgess received the sentence he must have known was coming: death by hanging. Sullivan, meanwhile, learned his escape wasn't as clean as he'd hoped. The pardon covered Manatū's party. It didn't cover James Battle. So Sullivan was tried separately for Battle's murder on the 19th of September. The jury took 25 minutes to convict him. He was sentenced to death. For a moment, it looked like his betrayal had failed him too. It didn't though. Police backed his plea for a pardon. The Crown had made a deal, and breaking it would outright mean no informant would ever trust them again. Sullivan's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Years later, he was formally pardoned. Unlike Burgess, Kelly and Levi, Joseph Sullivan walked away from those gallows. Sullivan lived because he talked. Whether he deserved to live is another question entirely. On the morning of the 5th of October, 1866, Nelson Jail prepared for the execution. Members of the Nelson Volunteers surrounded the jail to keep order. A crowd gathered outside. Inside, 3 condemned men approached the scaffold. Burgess, theatrical to the end, declared he had no more fear of death than he had of going to a wedding. He chose the centre noose and he kissed her. Kelly was in a different state entirely. He had to be carried to the scaffold. Levi stayed calmer, still protesting his innocence right to the last minute. The 3 men made their final statements. Then, just before 8:30, the trapdoor opened. A black flag was raised above the jail, telling the crowd outside that the sentence had been carried out. Burgess was dead, Kelly was dead, Levi was dead. The Burgess Gang was dead. But the story didn't die with them. The Mangatapu murders became more than a crime. They became a warning about what a young colony could look like when gold moved faster than the police did. When men carried fortunes through empty country. When a new name was easy to buy, and when a transported criminal could reinvent himself again and again until his past finally caught up with him. Richard Burgess crossed oceans. He changed names. He survived prisons, punishments, releases, and escapes. From London to Melbourne, from Australia to Otago, from Westport to Nelson, everywhere he went, he looked for the same thing: a target. On the Maungatapu Track, he found one. He also found the end of the road. The bodies were recovered from the hills, and today the story is marked in 2 places: by Murderer's Rock on the Mangatapu Track, where the ambush unfolded, and by the memorial at the cemetery where the victims are remembered. 6 men died before that end came. George Dobson, mistaken for someone else and murdered on the West Coast for a robbery that was never even his. James Battle, killed for the crime of having working eyes. Felix Mathew, James Dudley, John Kempthorne, and James de Pontius robbed and murdered on a mountain track for gold that turned out to be nowhere near enough to make the gang rich. An old farmer, the pack horse, shot and dragged into a gully because even an animal could become evidence. Levy had been the eyes, Sullivan became the mouth. Kelly was the shadow that never left Burgess. Burgess was the engine until the engine finally stopped. They wanted money and they created horror. They wanted silence and one of them narked anyway. And when the pressure came, the Burgess Gang didn't become legend. They didn't become rebels. They didn't become folk heroes. They became exactly what they'd always been. Predators, turning on each other in the dark. Richard Burgess tried to ride his way into history. Joseph Sullivan talked his way out of death. Kelly broke, Levy protested. And the victims were remembered not because they sought out danger, but because they crossed paths on an ordinary day with men who had made crime their trade and murder their solution. Today, the Maungatapu Track is remembered for what happened there in June 1866. A lonely track, a gang waiting in the hills, 5 men who never came home, and one name still attached to the whole bloody thing. Richard Burgess. A man who spent his life running from place to place, only to end up at the end of a rope in Nelson jail. He came to New Zealand chasing gold. What he left behind was blood on the Mangatapu Track. Because before it was Burgess's legend, it was the victim's last road. I'm Anthony. This is Southern Static. Stay safe and stay out of the static.